Rain falls in sheets across a battlefield that smells of ozone and death. The year is 2000, measured in the peculiar calendar that Shinra uses to mark the passage of their corporate dominion over the world. Behemoths lie scattered across mud churned black by combat, their massive bodies steaming in the downpour. And among the carnage stands a figure whose silver hair catches what little light penetrates the storm clouds overhead. His coat, black leather worn over shoulders that have carried the weight of impossible expectations, moves with the wind like the wings he does not yet possess. In his hand, a phone that refuses to connect, its screen glowing with the name Genesis Rhapsodos, a friend who will not answer. This is Sephiroth in the year 2000 of the planet's calendar, roughly 10 years before he would set Nibelheim aflame. Not yet the monster who would burn that village. Not yet the god who would summon Meteor. Still grasping at the fragments of humanity that warfare and enhancement have not yet completely stripped away. He stands alone among the dead, trying to reach someone who might understand what it means to be used as a weapon while being called a hero. And the silence that answers his call speaks volumes about how isolated he has already become. A voice cuts through the rain. Not Genesis, but someone unexpected. Glenn Lodbrok emerges from the tree line. Older now than the young soldier operative Sephiroth remembers, his face marked by years that have clearly not been kind. There is tension in Glenn's posture, anger in the way he grips his weapon. And when he speaks, there is accusation threaded through every word. He knows where Genesis might be, he says. He taunts Sephiroth with that knowledge, dangles it like bait, and then he issues a challenge that sounds more like a plea for confrontation than genuine combat. The moment hangs suspended. Two men who once fought on the same side now facing each other across a divide measured not in distance, but in choices made and bridges burned. And then, before the tension can break into violence, a dog appears. Not just any dog, but one that Sephiroth recognizes, one whose presence pulls him out of the present and back into memory. The dog's name is Refu, and his survival means that someone else has survived as well. Someone Sephiroth thought he had lost to the consequences of following orders that demanded the impossible. The confrontation deflates into something more complicated than simple hostility. Glenn warns Sephiroth about an incoming airstrike on Fort Tamblin, a military target where soldier defectors have gathered. People who walked away from Shinra's service and now face elimination for that choice. The information forces Sephiroth to move, to run toward people who need warning. But as he fights through the behemoths blocking his path, as he saves soldiers who look at him with gratitude and awe, something shifts in the way he understands his own story. He thinks back to a boy named Rosen, to an island called Sijat, to choices made when he was still young enough to believe that following orders and being strong were the same thing as being right. And in that moment of reflection, standing at the edge of what might be heroism or might be just another performance for cameras he does not want to see, Sephiroth confronts the question that has haunted him since childhood. What does it mean to be a hero? And is it possible to become one when everything about your existence was designed to make you a weapon? To understand how Sephiroth reached this moment of crisis, how a boy engineered to be the perfect soldier began questioning the nature of heroism itself, we must travel back roughly 8 years to the year 1992 in the planet's calendar. Back to when the silver hair was shorter, the coat was newer, and the legendary Masamune had not yet become an extension of his will. Back to a mission that should have been routine, to islands that most people had never heard of, to a time when Sephiroth was still learning what it meant to work alongside others rather than simply cutting through obstacles alone. This is the story of the first soldier, not the battle royale simulation that Shinra would later develop for training purposes, but the actual events that shaped a boy into the legend that would one day cast the longest shadow across the planet's history. This is the story of how Sephiroth learned about friendship and betrayal, about the cost of strength and the price of following orders without question. This is the story of Radore, of a swordsmith's curse, and of choices that would echo through the years until they culminated in madness and fire. The Shinra Electric Power Company had already achieved dominance over most of the known world by the year 1992. Their Mako reactors dotted the landscape like industrial monuments to humanity's hunger for energy, drawing the very life stream from beneath the Earth's surface and converting it into power that lit cities and fueled machines. It was exploitation on a planetary scale, but to most citizens living in Shinra's sphere of influence, it was simply progress. The lights stayed on. The trains ran. The alternative, which involved returning to a pre-industrial existence, seemed unthinkable to populations that had grown dependent on convenience and comfort. But Mako energy extraction required not just technological infrastructure, but also military force. There were always communities that resisted, nations that saw the reactors for what they were, territorial violations dressed up as economic partnerships. When diplomacy failed, which it inevitably did, when one party possessed overwhelming military superiority, Shinra deployed force. And for specialized operations that required more than standard security troops could provide, they deployed Soldier. The Soldier program had evolved through multiple iterations by the time our story begins. The earliest versions, classified as Project Zero or P0, produced operatives through intensive training and conventional combat enhancement, but without the genetic modification that would define later generations. These P0 soldiers, sometimes called passive class to distinguish them from the active enhanced types, were still formidable fighters, their skills honed through experience rather than cellular augmentation. They represented the bridge between normal human capability and what Shinra's scientists dreamed of creating. Proof of concept that elite warriors could be manufactured through selection and training, even before the more invasive procedures were perfected. Among the P0 class, 3 operatives had distinguished themselves through a combination of skill, luck, and the kind of interpersonal chemistry that makes teams greater than the sum of their individual capabilities. Glenn Lodbrok served as team leader, a role that suited his instinct-driven approach to combat and his ability to make split-second decisions that somehow turned disasters into survivable situations. His combat style favored heavy weapons and direct assault, the kind of overwhelming force that could shatter enemy formations and create openings for more tactical exploitation. Matt Winsard, nicknamed the Professor for his analytical approach to everything from combat tactics to the ecological systems they operated within, provided the intellectual ballast that kept Glenn's impulses from leading them into unnecessarily risky situations. Where Glenn trusted his gut, Matt trusted data. Where Glenn saw opportunities, Matt calculated probabilities. Their friendship was built on the recognition that both approaches had value, that intuition and analysis could complement rather than contradict each other when wielded by people who respected their mutual strengths. Lucia Lin rounded out the trio with marksmanship skills that had earned her the moniker Marks Queen among those who had witnessed her work. She could place shots with precision that seemed almost superhuman even without genetic enhancement, reading trajectories and compensating for variables that other snipers struggled to account for. But beyond her technical proficiency, Lucia brought a quiet intensity to the team, a focus that cut through confusion and identified priorities when situations deteriorated into chaos. She worried about their disposability within soldiers' ranks, understood better than her companions perhaps that they were valuable only so long as they produced results, that loyalty flowed one direction in organizations built on exploitation. The three of them had completed multiple missions together by the time they received orders to deploy to the Rador archipelago. On the surface, the assignment seemed straightforward enough. Survey the main island for suitable locations to construct a Mako reactor. Eliminate any resistance from Radaran remnants who might oppose Shinra's plans. Accomplish these objectives quickly and quietly. Establishing facts on the ground before international opinion could coalesce around the small island nation's sovereignty claims. What the briefing materials did not emphasize was the history behind those orders. Radore and Shinra had once maintained an alliance, a relationship built on mutual benefit when such arrangements still seemed possible. But something had shifted in recent years. The Radorans, who called the lifestream by its older name of Mana, and maintained spiritual practices that predated Shinra's technological dominance, had begun resisting the company's proposals for reactor construction. They understood, perhaps better than populations, that had already surrendered their autonomy. What would be lost if they allowed Shinra to tap into the mana that flowed close to the surface throughout their islands? When economic pressure and diplomatic maneuvering failed to produce compliance, Shinra shifted strategies. If the Radorans would not accept a reactor voluntarily, then the reactor would be built regardless of their objections. And if that required removing the Radoran population as an obstacle, well, there were precedents for such operations. Coral had burned. Other communities had been relocated or dispersed when they stood between Shinra and resource extraction sites that the company wanted to exploit. The Radorans would be no different, just another footnote in the corporate history of expanding the global energy infrastructure. Glenn's team departed for Rador in a helicopter that cut through clouds heavy with the promise of bad weather. The flight should have been routine, a few hours of transit followed by a careful reconnaissance of the islands before any direct engagement with hostile forces. But routine had a way of becoming complicated when you were conducting military operations on foreign soil against populations that knew the terrain and had every reason to oppose your presence. The explosion came without warning, a detonation that tore through the helicopter's cockpit and sent the aircraft spiraling toward the islands below. In the chaos of sudden descent, with alarms screaming and the vehicle breaking apart around them, the three soldier operatives had only seconds to react. Glenn and Lucia managed to stay together through the crash, their training helping them control their fall, enough to survive impact in a forested area near the shore. Matt was thrown further, separated from his companions by the violence of the helicopter's destruction, landing somewhere in the dense vegetation that covered much of the smaller islands. Glenn regained consciousness with his grandmother's name on his lips, a momentary regression to childhood vulnerability before training reasserted itself and pushed personal concerns aside in favor of immediate tactical assessment. Lucia stirred nearby, and together they took stock of their situation. They were alive, which already exceeded expectations for a helicopter crash. They had some equipment, though much of their gear had been scattered or destroyed in the impact, and they were somewhere on the Radaran archipelago, which meant they were still technically capable of completing their mission if they could locate Matt and figure out which island they had actually landed on. The presence of Balwa, creatures that thrived in areas rich with Mako energy, suggested they were not on the main island where the reactor was supposed to be surveyed. These monsters, drawn to concentrations of life stream like moths to flame, indicated significant mana flow beneath the surface, but the lack of military presence or civilian infrastructure suggested this was one of the smaller islands used for purposes other than habitation. Glenn and Lucia changed into backup outfits from their survival gear, grabbed what equipment they could salvage, and set out to find their missing teammate before the situation deteriorated further. The forest called Berman covered much of the island's interior, its trees adapted to soil enriched by proximity to the life stream. Moving through this terrain required constant vigilance, not just for Balwar, but for any signs of Radaran forces that might be patrolling the area. When they finally located Matt, the relief of reunion was tempered by the reality of their circumstances. They were off course, separated from their primary objective, without reliable communication to request extraction or clarification of orders. Matt suggested sending a distress signal, the prudent choice when a mission had already gone this badly wrong. But Glenn insisted they complete their survey mission anyway. His reasoning was partly financial, a debt he owed Matt that he could only repay through the mission completion bonus. But beneath the mercenary justification, there was something else. Glenn wanted to prove they could salvage success from disaster, that P0 soldiers were capable of adapting and completing objectives even when everything went wrong. It was pride, perhaps foolish pride, but pride that his teammates chose to honor by agreeing to continue rather than demanding they call for help. On the Lapaina coast, surrounded by Balwar that had caught their scent, the situation seemed to confirm that continuing the mission had been a mistake. These creatures, territorial and aggressive, closed in from multiple directions, and the team's ammunition was limited after the crash. They prepared to fight their way through, to thin the herd enough that they could escape to more defensible terrain, when unexpected help arrived in the form of a dog and the boy who accompanied it. The Radaran boy should have been their enemy. His people were the ones Shinra wanted eliminated, the obstacle standing between the company and another reactor site. But the boy saw soldier operatives in trouble and chose to help them anyway, using his knowledge of the local ecosystem to lead them to an orchard where the fruit scent repelled most of the monsters. It was an act of kindness that complicated the simple narrative of opposition and resistance, a reminder that people are rarely as simple as military briefings make them seem. The boy's name was Rosen, and his dog was called Refu. They lived alone on this island called Sijad, maintaining what Rosen described as the Eye of Radore, a monitoring station where he watched for disturbances in the mana flow and communicated warnings to his people on the main island through chimney smoke signals. It was a lonely duty, one he had performed his entire life, but Rosen accepted it with the kind of fatalistic dedication that comes from understanding your role in something larger than yourself. He knew why Team Glenn had come to Rador, understood their mission was to survey for a reactor that would wound the mana flow his people had protected for generations. And still, he helped them, because they were in danger, and it was in his nature to preserve life rather than ignore suffering. When a Balwar king attacked the orchard, drawn by the disturbance caused by the soldier team's presence, the battle that followed demonstrated why Shinra had invested so heavily in the soldier program. Glenn, Matt, and Lucia worked together with practiced coordination, covering each other's weaknesses and exploiting the monster's vulnerabilities until they drove it back, leaving the creature wounded but not destroyed. The Balwar king's appearance troubled Rosen, who speculated that the mana flow must be in imbalance for such a creature to emerge so aggressively. The islands were reacting to something, some disturbance that had upset the natural equilibrium. and Rosen's unease transmitted itself to the soldier operatives, even though they could not fully understand the spiritual framework through which he interpreted the world. Rosen wanted them gone, not out of hostility, but because their presence endangered the balance he was sworn to maintain. He provided them with a boat, a means to reach the main island and complete their survey mission, asking only that they leave Sijad to return to its peaceful isolation. Matt performed repairs on the vessel, replacing the boat's failing battery with one salvage from their crashed helicopter, and the three soldiers prepared to depart. There was something achingly sad about the transaction, the boy giving them the tools they needed to accomplish a mission that would ultimately harm his people, unable to do anything but minimize the damage by getting them away from his island as quickly as possible. The main island of Rador presented a stark contrast to Sijad's relative emptiness. Here, there were ruins, the remains of structures built by civilizations that had inhabited these islands long before Shinra's corporate empire existed. The Log's ruins, where their survey equipment indicated the strongest concentration of accessible mana, provided the kind of data that would make perfect sense to Shinra's engineers. High readings meant easy extraction. Easy extraction meant profitable operations. The fact that this extraction would drain the life stream that sustained the island's ecosystem was someone else's problem, not the concern of soldiers following orders to locate reactor sites. They transmitted their findings to company headquarters, confirming the Log's ruins as a viable location for reactor construction. The response should have been acknowledgement and new orders, probably to maintain position until engineering teams could arrive to begin preliminary construction. Instead, the transmission drew immediate attention from Radaran forces that had been monitoring for exactly this kind of incursion. The remnants of Rador's military, what remained after years of pressure from Shinra's gradual encirclement, had prepared for this moment, and they moved to eliminate the survey team before the reactor could progress beyond the planning stage. Team Glenn found themselves surrounded, outnumbered, forced to retreat into the caverns beneath the ruins. The Radarans pursued with determination born of desperation, understanding that this might be their last opportunity to resist before overwhelming force made resistance meaningless. The situation deteriorated rapidly, and it became clear that 3 P0 soldiers, however skilled, could not fight their way through an entire army of motivated defenders on their home territory. Then the sky opened and deliverance descended in the form of a boy with silver hair. The helicopter appeared without warning, hovering over the battlefield just long enough to drop a single figure into the chaos below. He landed with grace that seemed almost supernatural, absorbing impact that should have shattered bones, and in the moment between landing and his first movement, the Radoran forces must have seen what was coming. There are types of predators that can be recognized on sight, something in the way they carry themselves that marks them as existential threats, rather than merely dangerous opponents. Sephiroth moved through the Radaran army like disaster given human form. His sword, a military-issue blade called Nameless that bore the Shinra logo on its hilt, cut through armor and flesh with equal ease. Fire bloomed from his hands without apparent need for materia. Flames that consumed and reduced and left ash, where moments before there had been people. The Radarans tried to fight back, tried to use their numbers and knowledge of terrain to compensate for the impossible differential in individual capability, but it made no difference. Within minutes, the army was reduced to corpses and scattered survivors, and the boy, with silver hair, stood in the center of the devastation, looking almost bored by the lack of challenge. He introduced himself to Team Glenn with casual confidence, explaining that he had been sent to take command of their operation. His name was Sephiroth. They might have heard of him, he said, though his tone suggested he expected they had, and that he found the recognition tiresome. He was here to represent the new direction for Soldier, the transition away from passive P-class operatives toward genetically modified soldiers who could accomplish, through enhancement, what training alone could never achieve. He was, in essence, the future of warfare showing up to demonstrate why the past was obsolete. Glenn's reaction to Sephiroth's arrival was complicated by resentment and unease. He called the boy a cyborg, the words carrying accusation that extended beyond simple description. Glenn had joined Soldier to become a better fighter, to earn money for his grandmother, and prove himself capable of heroism through skill and courage. The idea that Shinra had been working on super soldiers who could make all that training and sacrifice irrelevant, that people could simply be manufactured with superior capabilities, struck at something fundamental in how Glenn understood worth and achievement. If strength could be purchased through genetic modification, what value remained in the struggle to earn it? Sephiroth heard the word cyborg, and something flickered across his face. Too quick to be called an expression, but present nonetheless. He had been called many things, most of them variations on weapon or tool or living demonstration of Shinra's technological supremacy. But cyborg carried connotations that cut through the propaganda surrounding his existence, implied that he was more machine than human, that the modifications had cost him something essential that P0 soldiers still retained. The label hurt in ways that Sephiroth had not yet learned to fully armor himself against, because at 15 years old, he was still young enough to want to be seen as a person rather than a product. He covered the reaction with professionalism, gathering the team with a whistle that annoyed Glenn further, and leading them toward the Corpine Caverns, where Radran remnants had established a base. On the way, Sephiroth produced a photograph from a locket around his neck, showing it to the team and explaining that this was his mother. Her name, he had been told by Professor Hojo, was Jenova. The photograph showed a woman with long, dark hair and delicate features, captured in a moment that seemed peaceful. What Sephiroth did not know, what Hojo had deliberately concealed, was that the woman in the photograph was actually Lucretia Crescent, his true birth mother, a scientist who had participated in the experiments that created him. Hojo had given him her image, but replaced her name with that of the alien entity whose cells had been injected into Lucretia during pregnancy. It was a cruelty that went beyond simple lies, giving Sephiroth proof that he had a mother, while simultaneously ensuring he could never find her. Sephiroth asked if any of them recognized her, if they had encountered anyone matching her description in their travels. It was a question he apparently asked everyone he met, this desperate searching for a woman who might or might not be alive, who might or might not have wanted the son that experiments had given her. Team Glenn looked at the photograph and could offer nothing except sympathy for a boy searching for connection in a world that had given him only utility. The Corpine Caverns descended into darkness that required artificial light to navigate. The remnants hiding in these passages had chosen their position well, using choke points and familiarity with the terrain to offset Sephiroth's overwhelming individual capability. But numbers and preparation could only accomplish so much when the opposition included someone who could throw fire and move faster than normal human reflexes could track. The battle through the caverns was methodical, a steady progression through defensive positions that collapsed under assault, and when Team Glenn emerged on the other side, they found themselves facing the uncomfortable reality of what Shinra's orders actually meant. Sephiroth ordered the elimination of every Radaran in the caverns. Not just the fighters, but everyone. Children, elderly, anyone who might theoretically pose future resistance or serve as witnesses to what had happened here. Glenn protested, argued that there were rules even in warfare, that slaughtering non-combatants crossed lines that should not be crossed regardless of orders. But Sephiroth had been trained by people who understood that moral qualms were weaknesses to be eliminated, that a good soldier needed strength in body, mind, and heart. And a hardened heart, ruthless and devoid of hesitation, was a sign of strength rather than cruelty. He explained his reasoning with the kind of logic that made terrible sense within its own framework. Children could be trained as soldiers, as Sephiroth himself demonstrated. The elderly might be veterans with decades of combat experience, more dangerous than their age suggested. If they showed mercy, if they left survivors who might reorganize and resist again later, then more people would die in future conflicts. The efficient solution, the strong solution, was total elimination of resistance here and now. It was pragmatism stripped of humanity, the kind of thinking that treats people as problems to be solved rather than lives to be preserved. While Glenn, Matt, and Lucia handled the Radorans inside the caverns, their reluctance visible in every movement, Sephiroth pursued those trying to evacuate, cutting down men and women and children who ran because running was all they could do. When the team reunited afterward, when the last screams had faded and the caverns held only corpses, they found Sephiroth standing among the dead with his sword still drawn. He had been injured, he admitted. One of the child soldiers had managed to wound him despite the vast gap in their capabilities, desperation giving the young Radoran enough focus to find an opening that should not have existed. The injury seemed to disturb Sephiroth more than the killing had. He touched the wound almost wonderingly, as if surprised that someone so weak could mark someone so strong. And in that moment, something cracked in the facade of ruthless efficiency he had been maintaining. Glenn saw it, that brief glimpse of a boy grappling with what he had been forced to become, and made a choice that would shape both their futures. He pulled Sephiroth into an embrace, this gesture of comfort and understanding that violated every protocol about maintaining professional distance from superior officers. Glenn apologized, not for his own actions, but for making Sephiroth feel like a tool rather than a person, for calling him a cyborg, when what he really was a boy trapped in circumstances he had not chosen and could not escape. The hug was awkward, Sephiroth clearly unpracticed in receiving physical affection, but he did not pull away. For a moment that stretched beyond its actual duration, two young men, who had been shaped into weapons by systems that did not care about their humanity, stood together in darkness and acknowledged the cost of strength. Over the following days, as Shinra's engineers began preliminary work on reactor construction, something remarkable happened. Sephiroth started spending time with Team Glenn, not because orders required it, but because he wanted to. They ate meals together, shared stories about training and missions and the small absurdities that made military life bearable. Glenn taught Sephiroth about slacking off, about taking breaks, and allowing yourself moments of rest, rather than constantly driving toward the next objective. Matt shared his knowledge of ecology and the fascinating interconnection of lifestream and life. Lucia demonstrated her sharpshooting technique, and Sephiroth watched with something approaching envy for skills that had been earned through practice rather than engineered into genetics. Sephiroth admitted during one of these conversations that this was the first time he had experienced what other people called having fun. Everything in his life up to this point had been training or missions or medical procedures designed to enhance his capabilities. He had been shown off to investors and politicians, used as a recruitment tool for Soldier through propaganda that fabricated achievements he had not yet earned, turned into a symbol before he had a chance to become a person. The tales of heroism that Shinra spread about him were lies, exaggerations designed to encourage young men to join Soldier by making them believe that greatness was achievable. Sephiroth had no desire to be a hero, he confessed. He simply wanted a normal life, whatever that meant for someone whose very existence was abnormal from conception. The team told Sephiroth about the Radran perspective on death and the lifestream, their understanding that consciousness returned to the mana after the body ceased, that individual existence was temporary, but life itself continued in an eternal cycle. It was a world view that treated death as transition rather than ending, that found meaning in the continuation of the whole rather than the survival of the individual. Sephiroth listened to these explanations with something approaching hunger, as if spirituality and philosophy offered answers to questions he had not known how to articulate. Glenn acted as a mentor during these days, a father figure to a boy who had never known paternal guidance beyond the clinical assessments of scientists. He encouraged Sephiroth to question orders, to think about the consequences of actions rather than simply executing missions with ruthless efficiency. He shared his own doubts about Shinra, the slowly accumulating evidence that the company they served cared nothing for its operatives beyond their utility. And Sephiroth isolated his entire life from perspectives that challenged Shinra's narrative, absorbed these conversations like someone starving for alternative viewpoints. But the interlude could not last. Shinra's reactor construction, aggressive and rushed to establish facts before international pressure could stop the project, destabilized the island's geological structure. The engineers had drilled too aggressively, used too many explosives, fractured bedrock that contained the mana flows keeping the island stable. Warning signs appeared in the form of tremors and geysers of raw life-stream energy erupting from fissures in the ground. The Galum Balwa, the massive Balwa that Glenn had nicknamed Stamp during their first encounter, returned transformed by exposure to uncontrolled mana, now enormous and increasingly aggressive as the island's ecosystem collapsed around it. Evacuation orders came through from Shinra Command, telling everyone to abandon the site before the island tore itself apart. The engineers and security personnel scrambled for helicopters and boats, concerned only with getting off Rador before catastrophe made escape impossible. But Glenn thought about Rosen on Sijad, about the boy who had helped them and now faced death because Shinra's reactor had destroyed the balance he was supposed to maintain. The order to evacuate did not include provisions for warning civilians, did not even acknowledge that there were people on other islands who deserved notification that disaster was coming. Glenn made a choice that was, by any military definition, treason. He defied evacuation orders, commandeered a helicopter with Lucia and Matt's help, and set course for Sijad to rescue Rosen before the mana torrent consumed everything. Sephiroth, given the opportunity to leave with the other engineers and maintain plausible deniability about the unauthorized rescue mission, chose instead to join Team Glenn. It was a decision that revealed how much he had changed in the days they had spent together, how deeply Glenn's mentorship had affected his understanding of duty and strength. They reached Sijad to find the island already fragmenting, ground splitting apart as uncontrolled mana tore through geological structures that had held for millennia. Rosen stood at his post, watching the destruction of his world with the calm of someone who had always known his duty would eventually require his death. He refused to evacuate when they found him, explained that his responsibility was was to remain at the eye of Rador until the very end, to bear witness and maintain his vigil even as everything collapsed around him. Glenn pleaded with him, argued that survival mattered more than duty to a people who were already gone, that Rosen owed it to himself to live rather than die for symbols and obligations. But Rosen understood something that Glenn did not want to acknowledge. He was the last Radoran. His people had been eliminated in the caverns, in the scattered settlements across the archipelago, in the methodical campaign of genocide that Shinra had disguised as counter-insurgency operations. There was no one left to return to, no community to rebuild. His death would not be tragic because his life had already lost its meaning when his people ceased to exist. He made a request that froze Glenn in his tracks. He asked Sephiroth to kill him. Not murder, but mercy. A clean death at the hands of a warrior, rather than being torn apart by the collapsing island or captured and processed by Shinra as a prisoner and curiosity. Death would return him to the mana, allow him to rejoin his people in the cycle of life and death that Radorans understood as the natural order. And if Sephiroth granted this mercy, if he ended Rosen's life quickly and cleanly, it would keep Glenn and his team safe. Dead people could not testify about treasonous rescue attempts, could not complicate the political situation for soldiers who had already risked too much. Sephiroth looked at the boy who was asking to die, at Glenn, whose face showed horror at what Rosen was requesting, at the island tearing itself apart around them. He thought about everything Glenn had taught him over the previous days, about questioning orders and choosing whose lives to value. And he understood that Rosen was giving him a gift, offering a choice between friends and duty, asking Sephiroth to prove that the lessons had taken root by choosing to preserve the people who had shown him kindness over abstract ideals about the sanctity of life. The sword cut quick and clean. Rosen fell without sound, his body going limp as death came instantly, sparing him the pain of prolonged dying. Sephiroth stood over the corpse with something like sorrow visible in his expression, recognizing the weight of what he had chosen, the cost of putting Glenn's safety above Rosen's life. It was pragmatism, cold calculation that one death was preferable to four. But it was also betrayal of everything Glenn had tried to teach him about the value of mercy and questioning orders that demanded cruelty. Glenn witnessed the killing from a distance, too far to hear the conversation, but close enough to see Sephiroth's blade fall. He saw only murder, the proof that all his mentorship had failed, that Sephiroth was exactly what he appeared to be on first meeting, a weapon, a tool of destruction wrapped in human form. The rage that flooded Glenn in that moment was compounded by his own guilt, the recognition that he had brought them to Sijat, that his choice to rescue Rosen had somehow resulted in the boy's death anyway. They escaped the collapsing island with Rafeu, the dog who was now all that remained of Rosen's existence. The helicopter fled through a sky thick with debris and energy, and silence filled the passenger compartment heavy enough to suffocate. The warmth that had developed between Sephiroth and Team Glenn, the tentative friendship that had seemed to offer Sephiroth a glimpse of normalcy, shattered against the reality of what he had done. Glenn could not look at him. Matt and Lucia said nothing, their own horror evident in posture and averted gazes. And Sephiroth sat alone with the knowledge that he had chosen friends over innocence, that he had prioritized Glenn's safety over Rosen's life, and that the choice had cost him the very friendships he had sacrificed a boy to preserve. The official report would describe the Rador mission as a complete success. Reactor site located, resistance eliminated, area secured for future development. The destruction of Sijad and the destabilization of the main island would be blamed on Radaran's sabotage, a convenient lie that transformed Shinra's engineering failures into enemy action. Team Glenn would receive commendations. Sephiroth would be praised for his exceptional performance in combat, and a boy named Rosen would become a footnote in classified documents, his death recorded only as casualty statistics in operations that officially never occurred on soil belonging to a nation whose sovereignty Shinra had systematically erased. Glenn would carry guilt about that mission for years, the memory of Rosen's death becoming the turning point when he began truly questioning whether Shinra deserved loyalty, whether strength without morality was heroism or simply violence with better public relations. He would eventually leave Soldier, join the forces opposing Shinra's dominance, and find himself at Fort Tamblin 8 years later issuing challenges to the monster that the boy with silver hair had become. But in the immediate aftermath of Rador, all he could do was watch Sephiroth disappear back into Shinra's training facilities and wonder whether he had failed the boy or whether the boy had always been beyond saving. For Sephiroth, the Rador mission marked the end of childhood in ways that even his engineered upbringing had not accomplished. He had learned that friendship was fragile, that kindness could be destroyed through single choices, that strength meant nothing if it could not protect the Geha, connections that gave existence meaning. He had killed someone who asked for death, granted mercy that looked like murder, and lost the only people who had treated him as human rather than weapon in the process. The lesson he took from Rador was that attachment led to pain, that caring about others made you vulnerable in ways that physical injury never could. He would throw himself into training with renewed intensity after Rador, pushing his capabilities to extremes that concerned even Professor Hojo, the silver-haired prodigy who had shown brief flickers of vulnerability, hardened into the legendary soldier first class that recruitment posters celebrated, the hero whose exploits inspired young men to join Shinra's military, and whose reputation grew with each successful mission. But the warmth that Team Glenn had glimpsed, the boy who wanted normal life and asked strangers if they had seen his mother, retreated behind walls constructed from necessity and pain. 2 years passed before Sephiroth's path would cross with Team Glenn's again. 2 years in which he completed missions across the world, his name becoming synonymous with Shinra's military supremacy, his presence on battlefields enough to break enemy morale before combat even began. He trained with other soldier operatives, formed working relationships with people like Angel Hewley, whose commitment to honor and mentorship offered echoes of what Glenn had tried to teach on Rador. But the connections remained professional, careful, maintained at distances that prevented the kind of vulnerability that had cost him so dearly when he allowed himself to care. The year 1994 brought new conflicts and new deployments. The war with Wutai, that island nation which had resisted Shinra's encroachment longer than most, intensified as the company decided to finally crush the last significant military opposition to their global dominance. Wutai possessed its own spiritual traditions around what Shinra called Mako energy, their own understanding of the planet's life stream, and their refusal to accept Shinra's technological exploitation of that power had made them targets for elimination disguised as liberation. Sephiroth deployed to the Wutai front alongside other elite soldiers, part of the overwhelming force Shinra committed to breaking Wutian resistance. The missions were brutal, villages burned and populations displaced, the kind of total warfare that left no room for questions about morality or justice. Sephiroth executed his orders with the efficiency that had become his trademark, moving through enemies like natural disasters given human form, and if he felt anything about the destruction he caused, He kept those feelings buried beneath professional detachment. It was during this period that he encountered Angel Hewley more frequently, the older soldier operative whose commitment to honor made him something of an anomaly within Shinra's forces. Angel spoke about the importance of dreams and pride, about maintaining personal integrity, even when serving an organization that seemed to lack any. His weapon, the Buster Sword, was a symbol of his ideals, enormous and unwieldy, but representing something more important than mere combat effectiveness. Angel treated that blade with reverence, rarely using it in actual combat to preserve its condition, and he tried to instill similar respect for symbols and honor in those who served alongside him. Sephiroth found Angel's philosophy interesting, if impractical. Dreams and honor were luxuries for people who had choices about how they lived and what they valued. For someone whose entire existence had been designed around combat effectiveness, whose value to Shinra was measured entirely through mission success rates and elimination efficiency, personal integrity seemed like weakness disguised as virtue. But Angel persisted in his mentorship attempts, and Sephiroth found himself drawn into conversations about purpose and meaning, despite his instinct to avoid attachment that might lead to more loss. The mission parameters that brought Sephiroth into contact with Team Glenn again involved investigating disturbances near Mount Nishabi, reports of unusual monster activity that suggested something was disrupting the local ecosystem. Intelligence suggested Wutayan forces might be manipulating creatures as biological weapons, training or enhancing monsters to attack Shinra positions in areas where conventional military operations had proven ineffective. The assignment seemed routine enough, the kind of search and destroy operation that Sephiroth had executed dozens of times. What he found instead was Team Glenn conducting their own investigation of the area, their presence unauthorized, and their intentions unclear. The reunion was tense, professional courtesy barely masking the discomfort that hung between them like smoke. Glenn acknowledged Sephiroth with the kind of distant respect that hurt worse than open hostility would have. And Sephiroth responded with similar coldness, both of them pretending that Rador had not happened or did not matter anymore. Matt attempted to bridge the gap with analytical observations about the terrain and monster behavior. Lucia said little, her sharpshooter's eyes assessing Sephiroth as potential threat rather than former comrade. The investigation led them to discoveries that complicated simple narratives about Wutayan aggression. The monsters were being affected by something, enhanced through methods that did not match Wutayan's spiritual practices or technological capabilities. Someone was experimenting with creatures in ways that suggested familiarity with Shinra's own research into genetic modification and combat enhancement. The implications were disturbing, suggesting that perhaps the enemy was not just Wutai, but something more complicated, factions within Shinra, or splinter groups with access to corporate research who pursued their own agendas. But before they could fully investigate these mysteries, new orders came through redirecting Sephiroth to a different crisis entirely. There had been an incident in a place called Robio, a weapons manufacturing facility where Shinra produced munitions for the Wutai conflict. Something had gone catastrophically wrong at the facility. Explosions and structural failures that suggested either sabotage or terrible accident. And now there were reports of survivors trapped inside who needed immediate extraction before the entire complex collapsed or detonated. Angel received the same orders, and the two of them deployed together toward Robio with the understanding that this would be a rescue operation rather than combat mission. As they traveled, Angel spoke about a woman he had met named Alyssa Goldie, a researcher or technician who had been assigned to Robio for reasons that remained unclear. He described her with obvious fondness, his tone suggesting she had made an impression that went beyond professional respect. There was something about her, Angel said, something that seemed out of place in the military-industrial context where most of Shinra's personnel operated with cold efficiency. When they arrived at Robio, the facility was chaos. Fires burned through sections of the weapons manufacturing areas. Structural damage had created hazards throughout the complex, and the survivors they were supposed to rescue were scattered across multiple locations. Angel split off to coordinate evacuation of trapped workers, while Sephiroth pushed deeper into the facility's interior, following reports of remaining personnel who had been cut off from escape routes by collapsed corridors and security lockdowns triggered by the disaster. He found Alyssa Goldie in one of the research laboratories, surrounded by equipment and documentation that she was frantically attempting to secure before evacuation. When she turned to face him, when Sephiroth saw her face clearly for the first time, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the world. She looked like the woman in his locket. Not exactly identical, the features were subtly different, but close enough that recognition hit like physical impact. The same dark hair, similar facial structure, eyes that held comparable warmth and intelligence. For a moment, Sephiroth could not speak, could not think beyond the overwhelming possibility that he had found his mother, that the woman Professor Hojo had shown him in a photograph might actually be here, alive, working for Shinra in weapons research facilities. Alyssa noticed his stare and responded with confusion that suggested she had no idea who he was beyond another soldier operative here for evacuation. She asked if he was injured, if he needed medical attention, her concern genuine and immediate in ways that reminded Sephiroth of how he imagined mothers were supposed to react to their children. He managed to explain that he was there to rescue her, to get her out of the facility before it collapsed completely, and she accepted his help with gratitude, but no recognition, no indication that she saw anything familiar in the boy with silver hair standing before her. During the evacuation, as Sephiroth guided Alyssa through damaged corridors and past structural hazards, he struggled with whether to ask directly if she might be his mother. The possibility felt too precious and too fragile to risk through direct confrontation. What if she denied it? What if the resemblance was coincidence? Or worse, what if she confirmed their relationship, but explained that she had abandoned him deliberately, that she had given him to Shinra's scientists and never looked back? The uncertainty was torture, but Sephiroth found himself unable to voice the question that consumed his thoughts. Alyssa spoke during their escape, sharing observations about Shinra's weapons research and her concerns about the direction the company was taking. She seemed genuinely troubled by what she had witnessed at Robio. Experiments that pushed boundaries between military necessity and unethical exploration. Her moral discomfort with Shinra's methods resonated with the doubts Glenn had tried to plant on Radoy. The suggestion that strength without ethical foundation was just violence wearing uniforms and following orders. They emerged from the facility to find Angel coordinating the evacuation's final stages, ensuring that everyone accounted for made it to transport before the complex's instability reached critical failure. Angel greeted Alyssa with obvious relief, his concern for her well-being evident in ways that confirmed she was more than casual acquaintance to him. Sephiroth watched their interaction and felt something uncomfortably close to jealousy, though whether he envied Angel's easy friendship with Alyssa or simply envied the capacity for uncomplicated care remained unclear. In the aftermath of Robio's evacuation, Sephiroth learned that Alyssa had been conducting research related to ancient weapons and their connection to Mako energy flows. Her expertise apparently extended to legendary artifacts, objects of power that predated Shinra's technological dominance and existed in the intersection between mythology and historical fact. One such weapon had been the focus of her recent work, a blade called Masamune that appeared in Wutayan records as something between cursed artifact and divine instrument. The Masamune occupied a unique place in Wutai's cultural memory. Forged by a swordsmith named Sekinoto Masamune, the blade was said to possess qualities that transcended mere craftsmanship. Stories described it as a weapon that could cut through anything, that responded to its wielder's will in ways that suggested consciousness or purpose beyond inanimate steel. But the same stories warned of the Masamune's curse, the way it influenced those who wielded it, drawing out aspects of their nature and amplifying them until the wielder became consumed by whatever the blade reflected back at them. Shinra had recently acquired intelligence suggesting the Masamune's location, information extracted from Wutayan prisoners or defectors about where the legendary weapon might be hidden. The company's interest in the blade was both symbolic and practical. Possessing Wutai's legendary weapon would deal psychological blow to resistance forces, while potentially providing Shinra's researchers with insights into how ancient civilizations had achieved effects that modern science struggled to replicate. The orders came down from high enough in the corporate hierarchy that refusal was not an option. Sephiroth would lead an expedition to locate and retrieve the Masamune. Team Glenn received similar orders, their assignment framed as supporting the primary mission, while actually serving as insurance against Sephiroth potentially failing or being compromised. The implication was not lost on Glenn. The suggestion that Shinra trusted their legendary super soldier only so far, that even Sephiroth needed handlers and backup in case something went wrong. It was pragmatic from the company's perspective, but revealing about how Shinra viewed all their operatives regardless of capability or loyalty. The expedition led them deep into Wutai's mountainous interior, following leads that took them through territories controlled by resistance forces, who fought with desperation born from knowing their nation was losing the war. The combat was constant, small unit engagements that slowed progress, but could not stop the advance of soldier operatives supported by Shinra's military logistics. Sephiroth moved through these encounters with practiced efficiency, and Team Glenn provided support that was professional, even if it lacked the warmth that might have existed before Rador's complications. Angeal accompanied the expedition as well, his presence serving as buffer between Sephiroth and Glenn, his commitment to honor helping maintain focus on the mission rather than personal tensions. He spoke about the importance of respecting enemy courage, even while opposing their objectives, about recognizing the humanity in those you were ordered to kill. It was idealism that seemed almost naive in the context of total warfare. But Angeal held to his principles with stubbornness that commanded respect even from those who could not share his convictions. The rescue mission led them deeper into the Igara Forbidden Zone, into ruins that predated Wutai itself by millennia. As they explored, Alyssa began experiencing strange visions, memories that were not her own, flooding her consciousness with images of a civilization called Igara. She described what she saw to Sephiroth and Angeal, her voice distant as if she were reading from some internal script she had never memorized. 2,000 years ago, the Cetra who settled in this region had been attacked by a malignant creature, something alien and terrible that the ancient warriors had managed to seal away only through enormous sacrifice. The battle had destroyed the Igara civilization, forcing survivors to flee north and eventually found what became Wutai. And then, they were ambushed by something that should not exist. A figure emerged from the shadows, wraith-like and wielding a blade of impossible length, introducing himself as the swordsmith Masamune. His voice carried weight that seemed to resonate beyond normal sound, and his presence radiated wrongness that made even Sephiroth hesitate. The swordsmith explained that he sought a worthy warrior to inherit his masterwork, that he had been waiting centuries for someone with the strength and will to claim the blade he had created. He sensed potential in Sephiroth, he said, and attacked with speed that forced both young soldier operatives to fight desperately simply to survive. The battle was unlike anything Sephiroth had experienced. The swordsmith moved with technique that transcended normal combat training, his blade seeming to lengthen and shift during strikes, creating openings where none should exist. He was testing them, Sephiroth realized, evaluating their capabilities and worthiness through combat that could easily turn lethal if they failed to meet his standards. When the swordsmith finally withdrew, disappearing back into shadows as suddenly as he had emerged, he left them with cryptic warnings about the blade's power and the cost of wielding it. Alyssa continued receiving visions as they pressed deeper into the ruins, fragments of the past revealing themselves through her consciousness. She saw the swordsmith in his mortal life, 500 years ago, when Robio village still thrived in the Igara region. He had been a master craftsman, renowned for blades that seemed to possess qualities beyond mere steel. But dark spirits connected to the sealed entity had compelled him to create one final work, a Nodachi that would be his ultimate masterpiece. The sword he forged was magnificent and terrible, a blade he named Masamune after himself, and its creation had consequences that destroyed everything he loved. The citizens of Robio had become entranced by the Masamune, fighting each other for possession of the blade, their conflict escalating into violence that consumed the entire village. The swordsmith himself had been unable to resist the weapon's call, wielding it against his own people, the blade growing hungrier for blood with each life it claimed. The more he fought, the more the sword's will dominated his own, until he was no longer a man, but something else entirely, a revenant bound to the weapon and unable to rest until he found a wielder strong enough to claim it and free him from his curse. The ancients who once lived in Igara had tried to stop him, conjuring purifying flames meant to destroy the corrupted swordsmith and his cursed blade. But the magic fire had proven insufficient, and worse, it had refused to extinguish, forcing the survivors to place sealing stones around the entire region and abandoned completely. The swordsmith remained, trapped between life and death, waiting in the ruins for someone worthy to lift the curse by claiming the Masamune and accepting its burden. Sephiroth felt drawn to the blade despite knowing the danger it represented. Or perhaps because of the danger, because part of him recognized kinship with a weapon that was both masterwork and curse, created with purpose that had twisted into something its maker never intended. The swordsmith appeared again, his spectral form more solid now, more defined by the purple magenta wisps that swirled around him like manifestations of the sealed entity's lingering influence. The battle was fiercer this time. Angeal and Sephiroth, fighting in coordination against an opponent who seemed to grow stronger as combat progressed. When they finally drove the swordsmith back again, when his form dissipated into those disturbing colored wisps, Sephiroth understood that this was a test he needed to complete. The Masamune was waiting somewhere in these ruins, sealed in a temple that only worthy warriors could access. Bachman's camera recorded everything with mechanical precision, documenting what would become propaganda about Sephiroth's acquisition of his legendary weapon. though the footage would be edited to remove anything too disturbing about the blade's true nature. They found the temple at the heart of the ruins, a structure that radiated power and malevolence in equal measure. Stone guardians barred their entry, monsters sealed in statues that awakened as they approached, forcing Sephiroth and Angeal to fight their way through supernatural defenses that tested every aspect of their soldier training. The battles felt ritualistic, each guardian representing a challenge that required both strength and understanding to overcome, forcing them to demonstrate worthiness through more than simple combat prowess. Beyond the guardians, in a chamber that seemed to exist outside normal space, the Masamune waited. The blade rested across a stone altar, its appearance both beautiful and menacing, craftsmanship evident in every line and curve. The sword was impossibly long, a nodachi that should have been unwieldy, but somehow conveyed perfect balance even from a distance. Sephiroth approached it slowly, aware that claiming this weapon would change something fundamental about his existence, that the blade carried power and purpose that would shape everything that followed. When he grasped the hilt, reality shifted. The sword responded to its new wielder, and Sephiroth felt power flowing through him that went beyond mere physical enhancement. The Masamune was reading him, assessing what lay at his core, and what it found was still unclear even to Sephiroth himself. A boy engineered to be weapon, filled with power and empty of purpose, searching desperately for meaning beyond what Shinra assigned him. The blade seemed to accept him not because he was worthy in any absolute sense, but because his story was still being written, because he remained unfinished in ways that meant he might yet become worthy of wielding such power. The swordsmith appeared one final time, his spectral form more peaceful now that the blade had found a wielder. He warned Sephiroth that the Masamune would show him truth about himself, that he could not hide from his own nature while wielding this weapon. It was both gift and burden, and how he bore that burden would determine whether he became the hero Shinra's propaganda claimed, or something far more terrible. Then the swordsmith faded completely. His centuries-long vigil finally ended, leaving Sephiroth alone with a sword that seemed to pulse with otherworldly presence. When they emerged from the ruins, when Sephiroth carried the Masamune into daylight for the first time, Angeal looked at the blade with expression mixing awe and concern. The sword was magnificent, yes, but there was something about it that troubled even someone as committed to honor as Angeal. He warned Sephiroth that power without wisdom led to tragedy, that strength without moral foundation became tyranny. The Masamune was not just weapon but responsibility, and wielding it required constant self-examination and ethical clarity that few warriors possessed. Alyssa watched Sephiroth claim the legendary blade with expression that was difficult to read, something between satisfaction and sorrow, visible in eyes that continued to remind him painfully of his mother's photograph. She spoke about how she felt the world was changing, that Sephiroth, taking up the Masamune, represented a turning point whose full implications would not be clear for years. Bachman recorded everything enthusiastically, capturing footage that would become part of Sephiroth's growing legend. Images of the silver-haired warrior wielding the impossibly long sword that would define his appearance in public consciousness. But none of them fully understood what had actually happened in that temple. What forces had been set in motion when Sephiroth claimed a blade that was connected to sealed Jenova remnants and cursed by dark spirits that had survived for centuries. The Masamune responded to Sephiroth's will, its edge never dulling, its balance perfect, but it also carried influences that would work on him subtly over time, amplifying aspects of his nature in ways that were not immediately obvious, but would prove catastrophic when combined with other revelations still to come. Team Glenn witnessed Sephiroth's success from a distance, saw him return carrying the legendary weapon, and their reactions reflected the complicated emotions that Rador had left unresolved. Glenn felt fear more than pride, recognition that giving more power to someone already frighteningly capable was recipe for disaster. Matt observed the Masamune's properties with analytical interest, but underlying concern about what it meant for Shinra to possess such artifacts. Lucia remained characteristically quiet, her assessment hidden behind professional composure. Angel congratulated Sephiroth on claiming the blade, but issued warnings that echoed the village elders' concerns. Power without wisdom led to tragedy, he said. Strength without honor became tyranny. The Masamune was not just weapon but responsibility, and wielding it required constant self-examination and ethical clarity. Sephiroth listened to these warnings with expression that suggested he understood intellectually, even if emotional comprehension remained elusive. In the quieter moments after the Masamune's acquisition, Sephiroth sought out Alyssa Goldie again. Drawn by the possibility of connection and the desperate need to know whether she might be his mother, he found her reviewing documentation about ancient weapons and their connections to life-stream energy, her expertise apparently extending to esoteric knowledge that Shinra valued but did not fully understand. When Sephiroth asked if they could speak privately, she agreed with curiosity that seemed genuine. He showed her the photograph from his locket, the image of the woman Professor Hojo had identified as Jenova, and asked if she recognized the person depicted. Alyssa studied the photograph carefully, her expression shifting through confusion towards something like sympathy as she realized what Sephiroth was asking. She told him gently that she did not recognize the woman in the image, that she was not his mother despite whatever resemblance he might see. She was sorry, truly sorry, that she could not be the connection he was searching for. The disappointment was crushing. Sephiroth had allowed himself to hope despite knowing better, had imagined scenarios where Alyssa would reveal herself as his mother, and suddenly his life would make sense, would contain anchor point beyond Shinra's designs. But she was not Jenova, just someone who happened to look similar, and the woman in the photograph remained mystery that Professor Hojo declined to clarify. Sephiroth thanked Alyssa for her honesty and withdrew, retreating back into the professional distance that protected him from further disappointment. But Alyssa was not finished with him. She spoke about her own research into ancient civilizations and their understanding of what Shinra called Mako energy. These older cultures had known truths about the lifestream that modern science was only beginning to rediscover, wisdom about balance and sustainability that Shinra's aggressive extraction methods violated. She mentioned a people called the Cetra, ancients who could communicate directly with the planet, who understood consciousness as something connected to the living world, rather than isolated in individual minds. She said that someone like Sephiroth, with his unusual capabilities and his connection to Mako energy through soldier enhancement, might have potential to access insights that normal humans could not perceive. He might be able to sense the life stream in ways others could not, might develop understanding of the planet's consciousness if he learned to quiet his mind and listen. It was speculation, half-formed theory mixing science and spirituality, but it planted seeds in Sephiroth's awareness that would grow in unexpected directions over the years. The war with Wu Tai ground toward its inevitable conclusion over the following months. Sephiroth and other soldier operatives conducted operations that systematically dismantled Wutai's military capabilities, forcing surrender through overwhelming force. The Masamune proved itself in combat repeatedly, its edge never dulling, its balance perfect regardless of situation, responding to Sephiroth's intentions with precision that made him even more formidable than before. The blade became associated with his legend. Images of Sephiroth wielding the impossibly long Masamune sword, entering popular consciousness as symbol of Shinra's military supremacy. But the victories felt hollow to Sephiroth, in ways he could not articulate. Each mission completed, each enemy defeated, each objective achieved, brought him no closer to understanding who he was beyond weapon. The Masamune showed him truth as promised, reflected back the emptiness at his core. But truth without context was just data without interpretation. He was strong, he was skilled, he was everything Shinra had designed him to be. And none of it answered the question of what it meant to be Sephiroth, rather than just soldier operative serial number, whatever designation they had assigned him. Glenn watched Sephiroth's evolution from distance, saw the boy he had briefly mentored on Rador becoming the legend that propaganda celebrated, and felt complicated mixture of pride and guilt and fear. He had tried to plant seeds of questioning in Sephiroth's mind, encouraged him to think about morality and choice, and perhaps those seeds had taken root in ways that would matter eventually. But watching Sephiroth wield the Masamune, seeing him cut through enemies with efficiency that no longer showed even traces of hesitation, Glenn worried that he had failed to save the boy from becoming exactly what Shinra wanted. The mission at Fort Tamblin would demonstrate how much Sephiroth had changed and how much remained constant. 8 years after Rador, standing among behemoth corpses in the rain with a phone that would not connect to Genesis, Sephiroth confronted Glenn and received warning about the airstrike coming to eliminate soldier defectors. The information forced choice between following orders that would allow his comrades to die and defying those orders to warn people who had turned traitor to Shinra. Sephiroth chose to run toward the fort, to fight through behemoths blocking his path, so he could warn the soldiers inside about incoming destruction. It was not the choice that Shinra would have wanted, not the action that obedient weapons were supposed to take when orders conflicted with personal connection. But it was the choice that the Masamune's wielder made, the decision that someone who had started questioning heroism after Rador's complications arrived at when confronted with similar dilemma. Glenn watched Sephiroth charge into danger to save people who were effectively deserters, saw the legendary operative putting himself at risk for soldiers who had rejected everything Sephiroth still served. And in that moment, Glenn understood that the seeds planted on Rador had grown into something neither of them could have predicted. Sephiroth was not the ruthless weapon he appeared to be. Not entirely. Somewhere beneath the silver hair and impossible strength, beneath the legend and the propaganda, there remained a boy who wanted to protect rather than just destroy. The soldiers at Fort Tamblin reacted to Sephiroth's arrival with mixture of awe and confusion. This was the hero of Shinra's propaganda, the legendary warrior whose presence on battlefields determined victory, and he was here warning them about danger instead of being the danger himself. Some recognized the cognitive dissonance, understood that something had shifted in Sephiroth's understanding of duty and loyalty. Others simply accepted the warning and prepared to evacuate before the airstrike turned the fort into crater. Sephiroth helped them evacuate, used his strength to clear paths and hold back monsters that threatened the escaping soldiers, demonstrated through action that whatever he was not simply Shinra's mindless instrument anymore. And when the last soldier had escaped, When Fort Tamblin stood empty, waiting for destruction that would come regardless, Sephiroth remained alone among ruins, thinking about choices and consequences, and what it meant to be hero rather than just strong. Glenn found him there, standing in what would soon be blast zone, apparently unconcerned about the incoming airstrike. They spoke briefly, acknowledgement passing between them of everything that had happened since Rador and everything that remained unresolved. Glenn offered something that might have been apology, or might have been absolution, recognition that he had judged Sephiroth harshly for choices that were more complicated than they appeared. Sephiroth accepted the gesture with quiet grace that suggested he had spent years thinking about that mission and its implications. Reifu appeared, the dog that had belonged to Rosen, somehow having survived everything that followed the island's destruction. His presence confirmed what Sephiroth had hoped, but not dared to believe, that his choice on Sijad had not been completely in vain, that something had survived the catastrophe, even if Rosen himself had not. Glenn explained that he had kept the dog all these years, memorial to the boy who died and reminder of the costs of serving Shinra without question. The conversation was cut short by approaching aircraft, Shinra's bombers arriving to eliminate Fort Tamblin and everyone who might have been inside. Sephiroth and Glenn separated, running in different directions to escape the blast radius, and behind them, the fort disappeared in thunder and fire. The physical destruction was thorough, strategic bombing that left nothing but rubble, but the meeting had accomplished something that no amount of firepower could undo. Sephiroth had confronted his past through Glenn's eyes, seen Rador's consequences reflected back through the man he had briefly considered mentor and friend. He had chosen to save defectors despite orders that implicitly demanded he ignore them, demonstrated that whatever Shinra had made him into, he retained capacity for choice and moral action. The recognition was both liberating and terrifying. Acknowledgement that he bore responsibility for his actions rather than being mere tool following programming. The years that followed would test that newfound understanding repeatedly. Sephiroth continued serving Shinra, continued completing missions that required him to hurt people and destroy things, but the absolute certainty that had characterized his earlier career fractured into something more complex. He questioned orders more frequently, though rarely openly enough to invite disciplinary action. He sought connection with other soldier operatives, building relationships that provided some buffer against isolation and exploitation. Shortly after the trauma of Rador, Sephiroth was deployed to the Wutai region on a rescue mission. Shinra had sent a squad of soldier operatives to investigate the ruins of Robio, a village in the Igara Forbidden Zone on the southern tip of Wutai, and the entire team had gone missing. Sephiroth arrived alongside Angel Hewley, then a second-class soldier who would become one of his few genuine friends, and a war photographer named Russ Bachman, whose job was to capture propaganda footage of soldier heroics. But the essential questions remained unanswered. Who was his mother? Why had she given him to scientists for experimentation? What did it mean that his entire existence had been designed around combat capability? The photograph in his locket remained mystery. Jenova remained name without context, and Professor Hojo provided no additional information, despite Sephiroth's increasingly direct questions. The uncertainty ate at him, undermined whatever stability he managed to construct from friendship and professional achievement. The Masamune stayed with him through everything, the legendary blade becoming so associated with Sephiroth that people forgot it had ever belonged to anyone else. The sword showed him truth as promised, reflected back the contradictions and confusion that defined his existence. But truth without resolution was just another form of torture. He was strong enough to cut through almost anything, skilled enough to complete missions that seemed impossible, and completely lost when it came to understanding his own purpose beyond what Shinra assigned him. His relationship with Genesis Rhapsodos and Angel Hewley would develop later, after the Masamune and Rador, as Sephiroth continued rising through soldiers' ranks, and these other enhanced operatives proved themselves worthy of notice. Genesis with his philosophical musings and growing resentment, Angel with his lectures about honor and dreams, both of them products of the same genetic experimentation programs that had created Sephiroth, all three bound by shared origins they did not yet fully understand. The path from Fort Tamblin to Nibelheim, from questioning hero to madman who would burn the world, was not as straightforward as Shinra's later propaganda would suggest. There were years between these moments, missions and experiences that shaped Sephiroth's understanding of himself and his relationship to the world. But the seeds of his eventual breakdown were planted during these earlier encounters, during Rador and the Masamune trials and Fort Tamblin. Moments when he glimpsed the possibility of being something other than weapon, and found that possibility perpetually out of reach. The training facilities where Sephiroth spent time between deployments were laboratories disguised as military installations. Professor Hojo maintained clinical interest in his creation's development, conducting regular assessments that measured everything from combat efficiency to psychological resilience. These evaluations were dehumanizing by design, reminders that however much Sephiroth achieved or distinguished himself, he remained experimental subject rather than autonomous individual. Hojo's questions probed at emotional responses and relationship patterns, seeking to understand whether the modifications had affected psychological development in ways that required adjustment or exploitation. Sephiroth learned to perform normalcy during these assessments, presenting whatever version of himself the scientists seemed to want, while keeping his actual thoughts and feelings carefully hidden. He understood that vulnerability in front of Hojo was mistake, that admitting to confusion or emotional complexity would simply provide data for further experimentation. The act of concealment itself created distance between his performed self and whatever authentic core might exist beneath the layers of conditioning and design, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish what he genuinely felt from what he had learned to simulate. The propaganda machine that built Sephiroth's legend operated independently of his actual experiences or preferences. Shinra's media division created recruitment materials featuring dramatized versions of his missions, turning complex military operations into simple narratives of heroism and victory. They manufactured achievements he had not earned, attributed quotes to him that he had never spoken, constructed personality traits that made him relatable to young men considering soldier enrollment. The Sephiroth, who existed in public consciousness, bore only superficial resemblance to the person who actually carried that name. This disconnect between legend and reality created profound alienation. Sephiroth could not escape his own mythology, could not move through the world without being recognized and judged against fictional standards that no human could meet. People who met him expected the hero from recruitment posters, confident and charismatic, and burning with passionate commitment to Shinra's cause. When they encountered instead someone reserved and uncertain, someone who questioned orders and struggled with purpose, the disappointment was palpable. He failed to live up to the legend that bore his name, and that failure was somehow his fault, rather than the fault of those who had created impossible expectations. The younger soldiers who entered the program inspired by Sephiroth's legend complicated his relationship to heroism further. They looked at him with worship that made his skin crawl, treated him as living embodiment of ideals he did not actually hold, sought his approval and guidance in ways that suggested they had confused propaganda for truth. Zack Fair was among these idealistic recruits, joining Soldier with dreams of heroism and determination to prove himself worthy of standing alongside the legendary Sephiroth. Zack's enthusiasm was both endearing and exhausting. He genuinely believed in the possibility of being hero through soldier service, thought that strength and good intentions were sufficient to make positive difference in the world. His optimism felt alien to Sephiroth, who had long since abandoned such simple frameworks for understanding morality and consequence. But there was something appealing about Zack's uncomplicated dedication, his ability to find joy in accomplishment and meaning in service that Sephiroth himself could not access. Angeal took responsibility for mentoring Zack, recognizing in the younger operative someone who needed guidance about honor and purpose before Shinra's exploitation could corrupt him completely. Sephiroth watched this mentorship from distance, remembering Glenn's attempts to teach him similar lessons on Radore, aware of both the value and ultimate inadequacy of such guidance, when the system itself was fundamentally exploitative. You could teach someone to maintain personal integrity within Shinra's service, but you could not make that service ethical simply through individual commitment to honor. Genesis's deterioration happened gradually and then all at once. He had always been temperamental, prone to philosophical musings about identity and purpose that others found pretentious, but that revealed genuine struggle with questions that had no satisfying answers. But something shifted during a training exercise. An injury that should have healed quickly instead became infected with something that looked like degradation on cellular level. His body began breaking down in ways that suggested the Jenova cells that enhanced him were becoming unstable, turning from source of power into something more like poison. The medical response to Genesis's degradation was clinical rather than compassionate. Shinra's scientists viewed his condition as data point, interesting problem that might provide insights into soldier enhancement processes, but not tragedy deserving of empathy. When Genesis learned that he was essentially dying, that his body would eventually fail completely as the cellular breakdown progressed, his response was rage directed at everyone who had made him into this. Shinra had created him as weapon, and now that weapon was malfunctioning, and rather than taking responsibility for their failed experiment, they were simply collecting data on how he deteriorated. Angeal tried to help Genesis cope with the diagnosis, offered friendship and support through the crisis, but Genesis's anger was too large for comfort to contain. He felt betrayed by everyone, by Shinra for creating him this way, by his own body for failing, by friends who could not truly understand what it meant to be dying from the inside out. His literary references became increasingly dark, quoting passages about heroes who fell from grace and monsters who destroyed what they could not possess. The transformation from friend to potential threat happened so gradually that Sephiroth did not recognize the danger until it was too late to prevent. Genesis's defection from Soldier was spectacular and destructive. He abandoned his post during a mission, taking other operatives with him, and when Shinra sent forces to retrieve him, he fought back with fury that bordered on suicidal. The battles that followed were personal in ways that normal military engagements never became, former comrades forced to confront each other across divide measured in loyalty and betrayal. Sephiroth found himself ordered to hunt Genesis, to eliminate the threat his former friend represented, and the orders felt like punishment disguised as duty. The phone calls that would not connect, Sephiroth standing in rain trying to reach Genesis and receiving only silence, were symptoms of relationship that had fractured beyond repair. Genesis was not avoiding Sephiroth specifically, but rather cutting all ties to his previous life, burning bridges that might tempt him back toward organization that had made him and was now hunting him. Every unanswered call was rejection, confirmation that whatever friendship they had shared meant less than Genesis's rage and desperation. Angeal's response to Genesis's defection was different, but no less troubling. He did not abandon Shinra outright, but instead withdrew into uncertainty, questioning his own creation and purpose with intensity that suggested he was approaching similar conclusions to those that had driven Genesis to desertion. When Angel learned the full truth about his origins, discovered that his mother had participated in experiments that made him soldier material before birth, the betrayal cut deep enough to shatter the honor he had built his entire identity around. The discovery that he was not naturally gifted, but rather engineered to be capable, that his achievements were built on foundation of genetic manipulation rather than earned through dedication, undermined everything Angel believed about himself. If his strength came from experiments rather than training, if his very existence was product of corporate desire for super soldiers, what value remained in concepts like honor and earned accomplishment? He had spent his life trying to be worthy of his own capabilities, and learning that those capabilities were purchased through his mother's participation in Shinra's programs made worthiness feel like a lie he had told himself to avoid confronting his true nature as manufactured weapon. Sephiroth watched both Genesis and Angel spiral into identity crises that mirrored his own unresolved questions about origins and purpose. He saw in their struggles reflections of fears he had not fully articulated, warnings about what happened when you finally learned the truth about how you were made and what you were meant to be. Part of him wanted to help them, to offer whatever comfort or support might ease their suffering. But another part recognized that he was drowning in his own uncertainty, that he had no answers to offer when he could not answer the same questions about his own existence. The mission to Nibelheim arrived in the midst of this cascade of personal crises. Sephiroth was ordered to investigate problems at the Mako reactor near the mountain village. Routine assignment that should have been straightforward inspection and problem resolution. Zack Fair would accompany him, along with other soldier operatives and a security detail of Shinra infantry. The mission briefing gave no indication that anything unusual awaited them. No warning that this routine assignment would become the turning point where everything Sephiroth had struggled to build would collapse into madness and fire. But before Nibelheim, before the reactor and the tanks, and the truth about Jenova, there was still time. Time when Sephiroth was still trying to understand what it meant to be hero rather than weapon, still searching for his mother's face in every woman who looked even slightly similar to the photograph, still believing that answers to his questions existed somewhere if he could only find them. The first soldier story, the tale of Glenn and Rador and the Masamune's trials, represented this period of struggle and growth before everything went irreversibly wrong. Looking back from the perspective of everything that followed, from Nibelheim's flames and Aerith's death, and Meteor descending toward the planet, the young Sephiroth of the first soldier seems almost tragic in his naivety. He believed, despite everything, that he could find purpose beyond what Shinra designed him for. That strength could be used for protection rather than destruction. That somewhere there existed answers to questions about identity and belonging that haunted him. The Masamune showed him truth, but he had not yet accepted what that truth meant, had not yet confronted the full horror of his origins and the implications for his future. Team Glenn, scattered to different fates after Rador, each carried pieces of the story forward in different directions. Glenn eventually joined the forces opposing Shinra, his disillusionment with the corporation complete after watching them destroy Rador and countless other communities in service of Mako extraction. His confrontation with Sephiroth at Fort Tamblin represented an attempt to save the boy he had briefly mentored, to pull Sephiroth away from the path that led toward becoming the monster propaganda claimed he already was. Whether he succeeded, whether the warning and reconnection changed anything about Sephiroth's trajectory, remained unclear even to Glenn himself. Matt pursued different paths, using his analytical capabilities to understand the systems that enabled Shinra's exploitation. He became convinced that the company's dominance could only be broken through comprehensive understanding of how power flowed and where vulnerabilities existed in corporate structure. His expertise made him valuable to resistance movements, but also made him target for Shinra's security forces. The last reliable reports placed him somewhere in the network of underground activists working to expose the corporation's crimes and undermine their economic dominance. Lucia remained enigmatic throughout, her ultimate fate unknown even to those who had served alongside her. Some reports suggested she continued working for Shinra in capacity that kept her away from former teammates, that whatever loyalty or pragmatism bound her to the corporation proved stronger than the disillusionment that drove Glenn away. Others whispered that she had died during mission that went wrong, casualty of the casual violence that defined soldier operations. Still others claimed she had simply disappeared, walked away from everything and everyone to start over somewhere that Shinra's reach could not find her. The Radran people were erased from history, except as footnote in classified documents about reactor site acquisition. Shinra's propaganda machine never acknowledged that genocide had been committed, never admitted that an entire culture had been eliminated to facilitate Mako extraction. The islands became just another set of coordinates where reactors pumped energy into the corporate infrastructure, their previous inhabitants reduced to statistics in reports that few people had clearance to access. Rosen's name appeared nowhere in official records, just one more casualty that Shinra considered acceptable cost of doing business. The Masamune continued serving as Sephiroth's weapon through all the years that followed its acquisition, the legendary blade becoming so associated with its wielder that separating their identities became impossible. When people spoke of Sephiroth, they mentioned the impossibly long sword. When they discussed the Masamune, they referenced the silver-haired warrior who wielded it with supernatural skill. The blade showed Sephiroth truth about himself as Sekinoto had designed it to do, reflected back the emptiness and confusion and desperate hunger for meaning that defined his existence. But truth without framework for processing it simply became another form of torture, mirror that forced confrontation with aspects of self that had no resolution. The village elder's warning about the Masamune revealing truth had been both accurate and inadequate. The blade did indeed show Sephiroth his true nature, amplified the core of who and what he was beneath layers of conditioning and performance. But she had not anticipated what would happen when someone whose true nature was question-marked, whose identity was built on lies and genetic manipulation, wielded weapon that demanded absolute clarity about self. The Masamune could not reflect truth to someone who was himself a lie, could not amplify essence that had been engineered rather than naturally developed. The result was feedback loop of uncertainty and searching, Sephiroth endlessly probing at his own origins, while the Masamune magnified his need for answers that did not exist. Every mission, every battle, every moment of wielding the legendary blade became exercise in confronting his own constructed nature without being able to resolve or transcend it. The sword was supposed to bring out the best in its bearer, to help them become idealized version of themselves. But what was the idealized version of someone whose entire existence was experiment gone wrong? Alyssa Goldie's research into ancient civilizations and their connection to the planet provided intellectual framework that would gain terrible relevance after Nibelheim. Her mentions of the Satra, of peoples who could communicate with the planet's consciousness, planted seeds in Sephiroth's awareness that would grow into obsession once he learned about his supposed connection to those ancients. The information she shared was meant to be academic, interesting theory about how older cultures understood the life stream in ways modern science had forgotten. She could not have anticipated that her explanations would become part of the foundation for Sephiroth's eventual madness. The question of whether Alyssa actually resembled Jenova, whether Sephiroth's perception of similarity was accurate or simply desperate projection, remained unresolved. Professor Hojo's photograph showed woman who might have been almost anyone, the image quality and framing making definitive identification impossible. Sephiroth carried the locket and its mysterious photograph through everything, protective talisman and source of endless frustration, proof that he had mother, even if he knew nothing else about her. The obsessive searching for woman who looked like that photograph, asking every new acquaintance whether they recognized the face, revealed how desperately he needed connection to something beyond Shinra's designs. The tragedy of young Sephiroth, the boy depicted in the first Soldier story, was not that he was evil or cruel by nature. The tragedy was that he was genuinely trying to understand morality and heroism and purpose, despite being created in contexts that denied him access to any of those things. He questioned orders when he could, sought friendship, even knowing attachment led to pain, struggled toward ideals he could barely articulate, because no one had taught him language for discussing ethics beyond Shinra's pragmatic calculations of efficiency and mission success. Glenn's brief mentorship on Rador represented the closest Sephiroth came to receiving genuine guidance about moral complexity. Glenn taught him that strength was not the same as rightness, that following orders did not absolve you of responsibility for harm caused, that the people you hurt in service of objectives had value independent of whether killing them advanced your mission. These lessons took root despite the traumatic context of their delivery, despite Rosen's death poisoning the relationship that had briefly felt like it might become something meaningful. The choice Sephiroth made on Sijad, killing Rosen to protect Glenn and preserve friendship that was already doomed, demonstrated both his capacity for moral reasoning and his fundamental confusion about how to apply that reasoning. He understood that lives had value, recognized that Rosen's death was loss rather than mere obstacle removal. But when forced to choose between competing values, between preserving one life and protecting people he cared about, he defaulted to pragmatic calculation that felt like betrayal of everything Glenn had tried to teach. The guilt Sephiroth carried about Rosen's death, buried beneath professional competence and legendary achievement, represented proof that he was still capable of moral feeling, despite years of conditioning designed to eliminate such weakness. Weapons were not supposed to feel guilty about fulfilling their function. Tools did not experience remorse about being used as designers intended. The fact that Sephiroth felt anything about choices he made, that he could recognize tragedy even when he participated in creating it, suggested human core remained beneath the genetic modification and psychological conditioning. But feelings without framework for processing them just created noise rather than growth. Sephiroth knew he felt guilt about Rador, but had no language for articulating why or what that guilt demanded from him. He recognized that friendship with Glenn had value, but could not explain what made interpersonal connection more important than mission completion. He wanted to be hero, but could not define what separated heroism from simply being strong enough to accomplish objectives. The confusion was genuine and profound, and ultimately unsustainable. The years between Radore and Nibelheim were spent trying to build stable identity from fragments and contradictions. Sephiroth attempted to be good soldier, while questioning whether soldier could be good in any meaningful sense. He tried to maintain friendships while Shinra's assignments systematically demonstrated that connections were vulnerabilities to be exploited. He sought his mother, while every lead proved false or misleading. The woman in the photograph remaining mystery that Hojo refused to clarify, despite Sephiroth's increasingly desperate questions. The relationship between Sephiroth and his creators was fundamentally transactional from conception onward. Professor Hojo viewed his creation as experimental success, evidence that genetic manipulation could produce super soldiers with capabilities far exceeding natural human limits. The fact that this success was also a person, someone with thoughts and feelings and desperate need for connection, registered only as interesting secondary data. Hojo's clinical assessments measured everything except the aspects that might have helped Sephiroth understand himself as human, rather than weapon. Shinra Corporation's exploitation of Sephiroth extended beyond military deployment into propaganda and recruitment. His image appeared on posters encouraging young men to join Soldier. His fabricated quotes used in media campaigns promoting corporate initiatives. His presence at public events serving as demonstration of Shinra's technological supremacy. He was made to perform heroism for cameras and investors, to embody ideals he did not hold in service of organization that viewed him as asset rather than employee. The performative aspect of his existence created additional layer of alienation, separation between who he was and who he was required to appear to be, for audiences who knew nothing about the reality behind the legend. The other soldier operatives who served alongside Sephiroth had complicated relationships with his legend and reality. Some genuinely admired him, saw in his capabilities proof that dedication and enhancement could create something genuinely extraordinary. Others resented him, viewed his achievements as proof that genetic advantages mattered more than effort or skill. Most fell somewhere between admiration and resentment, recognizing both his exceptional nature and the unfairness of comparing themselves to someone literally engineered to exceed normal limits. Zack's uncomplicated hero worship, his genuine belief that Sephiroth embodied everything soldiers should aspire to become, was almost painful in its naivety. He saw Sephiroth through lens of propaganda rather than reality, expected to find confident hero, and interpreted everything through that framework, even when reality contradicted expectations. When Sephiroth showed uncertainty or questioned orders, Zack assumed it was strategic thinking rather than genuine confusion. When Sephiroth maintained emotional distance, Zack read it as professional discipline rather than protective mechanism against further loss. The irony was that Sephiroth probably would have valued genuine friendship with someone like Zack, would have appreciated uncomplicated loyalty and enthusiasm that did not come weighted with expectations or judgment. But Zack's worship made authentic connection impossible, created dynamic where Sephiroth had to perform the legend, rather than simply existing as flawed person, trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Every interaction required maintaining facade, meeting expectations that had nothing to do with who he actually was, and the effort of constant performance only increased the isolation that made connection seem valuable in first place. Genesis's degradation and defection created crisis that forced Sephiroth to confront the possibility that Shinra's enhancements were not gifts, but curses with delayed consequences. If Genesis was breaking down on cellular level, if the Jenova cells that provided his abilities were turning toxic, what did that imply about Sephiroth's own future? He had been enhanced through similar processes, subjected to experiments that treated human biology as raw material to be modified and optimized. The possibility that his own body might eventually turn against him, that strength purchased through genetic manipulation carried hidden costs, added new dimension to his existing uncertainty about identity and purpose. But he could not ask these questions directly without revealing vulnerability that Shinra would exploit. Admitting fear about potential degradation would simply provide Hojo with more data, more opportunities for invasive testing and clinical assessment. So Sephiroth kept his concerns hidden, watched Genesis's deterioration from distance, and wondered whether he was seeing preview of his own eventual fate. The isolation this created was crushing. Being surrounded by people while unable to share fears that consumed his thoughts, maintaining professional facade, while internal certainty about his own nature and future crumbled. Angeal's crisis was different but equally relevant to Sephiroth's struggle. Learning that his capabilities were engineered rather than earned, that his very conception had been manipulated by Shinra's desire to create soldier material, destroyed foundation that Angeal had built his sense of honor upon. If strength came from experiments rather than training, if achievements were predetermined by genetic advantages, what meaning remained in concepts like earning respect or proving worthiness? The questions that broke Angeal were exactly the questions Sephiroth had been avoiding through strategic ignorance, and watching his friend's breakdown was like seeing his own potential future written in another person's suffering. The three of them, Sephiroth and Genesis and Angeal, represented different responses to discovering that your existence was product of corporate exploitation rather than natural development. Genesis chose rage and destruction, burning connections and turning his power against organization that made him. Angeal chose paralysis and eventually self-destruction, unable to reconcile honor with origins that made mockery of earned achievement. Sephiroth had not yet chosen when Nibelheim arrived, was still trying to find third option that preserved some version of self while acknowledging terrible truths about his creation. The mission briefing for Nibelheim mentioned nothing about Jenova, gave no indication that the reactor inspection would force Sephiroth to confront mysteries about his mother and origins that had haunted him since childhood. If he had known what waited in that reactor, if someone had warned him that sealed in the facility's depths was the source of the cells that made him soldier, would he have refused the mission? Would he have run from truth rather than confronting it? The questions are meaningless speculation, but they reveal how unprepared Sephiroth was for what he would discover, how fragile his constructed sense of self remained despite years of building walls against uncertainty. The boy who killed Rosen on Sejad, who confronted Team Glenn at Fort Tamblin, who wielded the Masamune with skill that seemed supernatural, was still trying to be hero despite not knowing what that meant. He still searched for his mother's face in strangers, still questioned whether strength without purpose was meaningful, still believed somewhere that answers existed if he could only find them. The transformation from this confused but relatively innocent person into the monster who would burn Nibelheim and eventually try to destroy the planet was not inevitable. It was tragedy that could have been prevented through simple honesty, through someone explaining truth about his origins before he discovered it in worst possible way.